Hey guys, so happy 2025, and so as usual I wanted to provide a tier list of the best meta and rogue decks using data from regional level topping information as well as Dueling Book data. Unfortunately no YCS level events so far post ban list, but hopefully we can get that for next month. And as always, definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies. You guys have been using it a lot, so really grateful for that. And also, as always, definitely a shout out to YGOProDeck.com as well as Ivan for keeping up with all of the meta relevant topping decks. Anyways, let's just get started with the meta tier list for this month. So we are starting with Ryzeal. So you know what? I thought maybe Maliss would have caught up a little bit more by now, but turns out it hasn't really. Ryzeal has taken up about 41% of the topping pie chart post ban list. So you know what? After Supreme Darkness, once Twins of the Eclipse comes out, I'm actually pretty scared because that card is really good for Ryzeal in terms of being able to sort of survive like the board breakers, let's say namely Book of Eclipse, which has been pretty popular choice lately. So you know what? It's a very consistent deck for the most part. I think it's going to be played with like the Fiendsmith stuff. And also keep in mind, I actually recently did a video breaking down the cost of like the top 5 meta decks right now. So certainly go take a look at that in case you wanted to, you know, splurge on a meta deck for once for 2025. And then you have Maliss. So this is a deck that, you know, has been really popular. I think it's super good, especially game 1. It's very scary, especially when they go first. But I think it's just post-side, they get notably weaker compared to something like Ryzeal, because something like Lancia, Chaos Hunter have also seen some play. And even, who knows, maybe someone's trolling and play Imperial Iron Wall to prevent vanishing. So they're very big blowout cards for them, for Maliss, in terms of just not being able to banish. That's very hard to stop, other than something like, let's say, Call by Crossout. So you know what, I think that's maybe what's holding them back at the moment, but nonetheless, you know what, I think it seems to be a very fun deck for people to play. And I actually recently did a video surveying the players that run Maliss, and you can sort of look at that to get a better sense of, you know, key strengths and key weaknesses of this deck. So then I'm just going to sort of create a new line in terms of tier 1.5, because the score really drastically drops off after the first 2 decks that you see. And then you have Kashtira Fiendsmith. As I've mentioned multiple times, this is kind of a weird deck just because it's more like an engine and just hand traps, right? Like you have very small number of Kashtira cards. It's not really like the pure Kashtira deck that we've come to know since, you know, it's tier 1 days, and then you just have Fiendsmith and just a bunch of hand traps. So you know what, it's kind of a weird mix, but this is definitely was one of the top 5 decks in my cost breakdown video in case you were interested in it, but it is actually a pretty expensive deck. And then you have Tenpai Dragon. Somehow it's actually gotten a couple more tops recently, and you know what, it's usually played with like Fiendsmith stuff now, so it's also actually a pretty expensive deck technically. I know Tenpai core on its own is very dirt cheap, but to actually play it optimally, especially with those limits on the recent ban list, like you do have to play it in a more expensive fashion, but you really can't underestimate them now. They are actually still thriving in the sense, at least compared to maybe some expectations that we had. And then you have Yubel, which, you know what, uninterrupted, the deck is very scary. Its turn 1 board is still incredibly strong in that sense, with like Varudra's Omni Negate, you have Phantom Yubel, and just like other stuff with like Fiendsmith stuff essentially. But then you have, let's say, Molchami Fualos, which is where this deck really started falling behind, just because this deck gets hit really hard by Perlia and Fualos, so it really keeps them at bay. But nonetheless, you know what, still under the radar, still doing pretty well. The Yubel core on its own, if you watch my cost breakdown video, is actually still pretty affordable. It's just sort of like the Fiendsmith stuff that kind of gets in the way of that. But you know what, a deck that if you maybe already have the Fiendsmith stuff, you can kind of look into it as well. So moving on to tier 2, we have Labrynth, and yes, some of the topping lists were playing Fiendsmith stuff, but most of the topping ones actually were not playing Fiendsmith and were sort of running it the quote-unquote pure way, which makes it a lot more affordable in that sense. And also, they weren't really playing a lot of Floodgates either. I mean, there was one list main decking Skill Drain and Ravelry, but the remaining Labyrinths were really just playing like your normal traps, right? Daruma Can is very popular. Some were even playing Compulse and Torrential Tribute, for example. They were also playing Impulse as well, which ironically also hits this deck too, but you know what, the deck can play it, so I guess that makes it a little unaffordable if you want to play it ideally, I guess. But nonetheless, I think aside from D Barrier, which is super toxic, should be banned, but aside from that, I think this deck is actually pretty cool and actually hanging in there quite a bit. So next we have Voiceless Voice, which surprisingly has actually kept its place since the last meta tier list as well. In the tier 2 status, it has been kind of in the rogue section after briefly being tier 1 for a little bit when it first came out. So there are some Fiendsmith Voiceless Voice that top. I mean, Fiendsmith packages, they're light, so there is some synergy there. But for the most part, the ones that are topping is actually sort of like your quote-unquote pure way with Dogmatica stuff like the Nadir Servant and Maximus. So that's pretty cool. Online, I've also noticed Voiceless Voice being mixed up with, let's say, the Ruge archetype, the one that's kind of forgotten from crossover breakers outside of Maliss and Ryzeal. And so that was kind of interesting. The Ruge stuff kind of provides like a monster negate, some pops here and there. That version, unfortunately, has not topped yet, but I'm sure people will probably be trying that out. So then we have Memento, and I know in the last meta tier list, people were asking, hey, where did this deck go? Because at the time, there weren't any known tops with Memento, but now fast forward a few weeks later, and you know what, you actually have several of these. So I'm gonna assume it's pretty good for them right now, because Ryzeal, with Detonator, they're just trying to pop your stuff, and you know what, Memento, like, they're just gonna trigger anyway. It's kind of like Unchained, I guess, if someone were to play it in terms of like their monsters being popped. So I think Memento can definitely be pretty scary. Definitely always feels like they have so much gas, even when they go second, for example. Although their key weakness is definitely Dimension Shifter, they seem to just have no real plays around that, unfortunately. And then you have Magical Musketeer Fiendsmith. As I kind of talked about with like Kashtira Fiendsmith, it's kind of like the similar logic, just like a couple engines and then just hand traps. So I don't think there's really anything too special about this deck on its own in terms of identity. But you know what, still doing pretty well, because Fiendsmith is just really strong package. And then you also have Goblin Biker. Unfortunately, the tops for this one really also came kind of earlier in the format in terms of right after the ban list. I haven't really seen recent success, I don't believe. At least that's not known at the time of doing this video, but I think it's still pretty cool when you have like an Xyz based deck like Ryzeal doing really well. Goblin Biker can kind of thrive in that instance. And then moving on to Rogue, we have White Forest. So you know, it's funny, the topping White Forest decks, they're not playing with the runic stuff anymore, at least the ones that were known and the deck lists were available. So I guess they sort of moved on to with like Azamina and Fiendsmith engines. So I guess you have like your typical Fiendsmith part in terms of your end board, but you know, the Azamina, or rather the White Forest stuff, can also provide like the Book of Eclipse. You have like your little Zapper Shrimp play to pop the back row, and Chaos Angel play. So synchro stuff, always really cool, always pretty popular, but at the same time, we do have D-Barrier on the format right now, so they are still going to get caught in the crossfire in terms of being called synchro. So next you have Fire King, obviously fallen a lot since its tier 1 days, but I mean, purely from a rogue perspective, I think it's actually a really good option as well. I mean, it has like monster negate, lots of pops, can be very strong if you can play it well. Some topping lists were actually still playing like with the snake guy stuff. I don't really think it actually bridges in anymore, but nonetheless, you know what, they're still topping with it. So next you have Mermail, which somehow has actually fallen now to the rogue level again. It did have its like tier 2 days briefly just before the last ban list. I mean, I don't know if much has really changed for them. I think going first, this deck is super scary, right? Just being able to discard cards, or rather hand loop opponents, and then also set up multiple Omni Negates. Going second is where players have usually kind of said that the deck can struggle, but I mean, I feel like every time I face them, they just always seem to have so much gas going second that they do have some main deck ways to like break boards as well. So I think this deck is definitely really scary if you don't play hand traps or don't draw hand traps. So then we have Ritual Beast, which is funny because it's another deck where all the Charmies hit them, right? Fualas Purlia, and now the new one that's coming out in Supreme Darkness will also hurt Ritual Beast, but at the same time, there's still players playing it and also doing pretty well in topping. It is a pretty hard deck to pilot. The deck is scary though, because it will still provide, or rather put out something like Protoss, which is always very hard to stop and just kind of hard to play around. They have usually other floodgates, you know, they can play Baguska, they can play Colossus if they really wanted to, so it is a really scary deck if it can go off, and also of course can play Shifter. So then we have Centurion, which is a deck that was missing in that last month's meta tier list, because at that point earlier in the format, Centurion didn't have any tops. It's picked up a bit since then. I was looking at the topping deck list. Nothing has really seemed to change in terms of deck list wise. You know, they're still playing like your Bestial package, and they're also bringing out Blazing Quasar, which is, you know what, honestly really scary. At the same time, I guess with Ryzeal in the format, which is just going to keep popping stuff, and you try to bring out your monsters from like the Dispel Trap Zone, I guess it's probably not the best for Centurion, but you know what, at least getting some success lately. And then you have Plant Link. Unfortunately, the tops for this deck has all been from the beginning. That was in the last month's meta tier list, so hasn't really had much recent success, I don't believe, at least that are not known. But you know what, there's always bound to be some players topping with plants, I guess. So then you have Dark World, which actually has 2 regional tops now post ban list. It's another hand loop kind of deck, kind of similar to Mermail. Really toxic kind of playstyle, not a fan of those hand loops, but I mean, you know what, it is actually doing pretty decent so far in the post ban list. It usually comes every now and then, every few months. It's not really consistent in terms of how well it does, but it always seems to be pretty popular among players, at least online. So then we have Mimigul. Unfortunately, kind of similar to like Goblin Biker as well as Plant Links, their regional tops actually came sort of right after the ban list kind of happened, so earlier in the format. So most recently, I don't think it's seen actually much success, at least among the tops that are known. At the same time, I've definitely noticed a lower play of Dominus Impulse than the previous to the ban list, just because let's say like Ryzeal, they have lights, and just so many decks playing Fiendsmith stuff right now, they're all lights, and Dominus Impulse is going to conflict with that. And Dominus Impulse also happens to prevent Earth effects, which is why it made Mimigul so kind of awful because it kind of defeats their whole strategy. But with the lower player of Impulse, Mimigul can actually play again, so kind of nice to see. And so then we have Blackwing in the final tier. So they actually have 2 regional tops with this post ban list. So I wasn't able to find the deck list though, so I don't really know if the playstyles changed since their last support in Darkwing Blast a few years ago. Basically, they would put out like the synchros and burn for like 700 each time like an effect's activated. So I don't know if that's changed. Definitely let me know if you are aware of Blackwing in the current format, but you know what, it actually has some tops. And finally, we have Branded Despia. So among the decks that have 1 regional top post ban list, and there's several others, right, like Flunder, Sky Striker, Tier Elements, Rescue Ace, but among those decks with just 1 regional top, Branded Despia was still at the top in terms of online play among those decks, so that's why I decided to put it here. I swear to you, this deck is definitely very playable right now. Even with the Gimmick Puppet ban, you know, you really don't need it anymore. There's just so many like layered interactions that this deck can put up. And against Ryzeal and Maliss, I actually really feel confident going against those decks. As some of you may be aware, I've been playing this deck for about 2 years now. I mean, even I was pretty close to topping a remote regional with this a couple weeks ago. I was like 1 win away. So I think there's definitely a realistic chance for some other actual good players to top with this deck. So really have high hopes for this one too. Anyways guys, that was it for the meta tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting and helpful as you prepare for your upcoming events. Obviously we have Supreme Darkness coming around in the corner, so the meta will shift yet again. But you know what, stay tuned for another future meta tier list once that drops. Anyways, big thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to my patrons and sponsors as well for the continued support, and well, take care guys.